Welcome everyone to UFO Unlimited. Today I've got a great guest coming all the way from the UK. His name is Neil Nixon, and we're going to talk about his book, UFOs. The wave just threw me off there, Neil. UFOs, aliens, and the battle for the truth.
That's it, yeah.
And
UFOs, aliens, and the battle for the truth. Yeah, it came out. Obviously it's still available. It came out World UFO Day 2021.
yeah, it's a very interesting read. And how did you, in terms of UFOs, what got you interested in UFOs and led you to write that book?
Right, but so what got me interested in it? I can't remember a time before I was interested, and apologies to anybody who's watching your podcast and has already heard me on another one, but I do tend to tell a story about this. I can't remember a time before I was interested, and the pragmatic side of me, the sort of common sense side of me says, well, if you're my age and you grew up when it was still exciting that people were going into space and there was all this speculation about what we might find, then I think I'm just a product of my times, really. But because I can't remember a time before I was interested, I was years and years ago now, over 20 years ago, I think it was a 40 Time Zone convention, which was a big paranormal conference that used to happen in the UK. And I'd just come off doing the talk on stage that I was doing that time, and somebody asked me in the backstage area about when I'd been interested in this, and I said, well, I can't remember a time before I was. And some random person that was in the same area at the time came over to me and said, well, I can explain that. He said, you were abducted as a baby. And I don't think so. I seriously don't think so, but it's always been there. So it's something I've always been aware of. I can't remember a time before I was interested in mysteries and just the whole area of strangeness. But I wouldn't want to ascribe anything to it other than I am, I think, just the product of my times, really.
Gotcha. Yeah. I remember I was always fascinated with it too, and I really had no reason to be, but I would sit outside and just look at the clouds and always just wonder, what's out there. And I'd look at the stars, and eventually I'd see a UFO show on TV or something every once in a while. And I think, I kind of believe that's possible. And, so.
Well, it was very much that way for me. So intuitively, whenever I saw stuff like that, and it's not just to do with UFOs, but it's to do with all the mysteries that paranormal mysteries that people get interested in. Yeah, my instincts from an early age were to think, yeah, that's probably true and that's possible. Now, I've become more skeptical over the years. I mean, look, I hope we can tease this out on the interview. I've done quite a few interviews in the United States, and I know there's probably more in America than there is in the UK where I live. The second you say you're skeptical about something, it's almost like you're put into a camp right away. Like, well, then you're spoiling our fun.
Right.
I'm not. I'm kind of critically skeptical. So a lot of the things I believed blindly when I was much younger have definitely been overturned with the amount of evidence of things that I've seen. And certainly one of the earlier experiences for me was that, because if you grew up in the UK, the bulk of the UFO books you could buy were American. And so I ended up reading, Brad Steiger and the people that were publishing in the 60s and 70s, Carl and Jim Lorenzen. And when I was about 13, I read Flying Saucers Have Landed by George Adamski and Desmond Leslie. And how do you put it? The George Adamski bit, that was the first point where I got really skeptical. I mean, written in the 1950s, he meets a guy from Venus and whatever. And I'm
Right.
So I've come across things like that which have changed my viewpoint as I've been going, but I've never lost interest. And if we skip almost like to what I'd normally say at the end of a talk or something, however skeptical you get, the one thing I do quite a lot of live talks on this again now, because the pandemic lifted and we're getting bookings for it and stuff, and it's just in the nature of it. If you go anywhere and talk about this subject to people, somebody will come and share an experience with you. And two things I would say about virtually all of those stories that I hear. Number one, they experience it as real. So if you, you can't trust a polygraph, but if you could find some way of wiring people up to something that you could absolutely, determine is the truth, they're telling you a true experience. And secondly, without any doubt whatsoever, people are changed by these experiences. And the kind of pat thing that I say often when I'm talking about it, if you want to put it on a par, it's akin to about as significant in your life as having a car accident or similar. Something that probably won't completely change the course of your life, although in a lot of cases it does, but certainly something that you can't forget and that lives with you for quite a while and you end up processing. Yeah,
that's exactly what happened to me. I've had I'd say, like, safely, undoubtedly 8 sightings where it could have not been anything that of this earth that we're aware of, technology wise, and many more other very short sort of sightings where I kind of don't include them because they were only like a split second or two. I just kind of saw something dart off,
Yeah.
But yeah, before that, it's weird. It's almost like we're pre-programmed not to even accept, we just sort of automatically kind of laugh it off. But what are the experiences, rather, if any, that got you, they sort of shaped your views on the subject?
Well, I suppose one thing that very early on in my life, I saw something. If you find the Wikipedia page on this, it's a thing called the Bavidi Meteorite, and it came across the UK and crashed in Northern Ireland, which I don't know how well. I'm never sure how well Americans understand British geography, but the United Kingdom is its islands basically, and there's a chunk. The island has got a southern part, which is an independent country, and a northern part, which is what remained in the UK after they had their war over a century ago, and the Republic was formed. The meteorite came down in the northern part of it, and I saw that, and it was, on the one hand, it was briefly just absolutely amazing because it was unquestionably this massive fireball just shooting across the sky. You could see it right out of the house, and it came pretty much over our house. So I remember running out the back. I was a kid, and the whole family went out. Like, we wondered what the hell this thing was, and it was breaking up in the air and flashing. So long after the press had said, well, this meteorite came in last night, and they found it now. It crashed in Northern Ireland or whatever. It was just the sheer awesomeness of that. That was quite a defining experience, because I was quite an imaginative kid anyway. So the fact that this thing happened and I saw it, that was definitely a kind of defining experience. And I think I've mentioned another key one, which is just because I was so interested, I would consume any amount of literature, and I think it's probably easy to underestimate this now, but it's a different experience if people are getting into the whole area of UFOs now, because the first things they see are videos on places like YouTube where the comments underneath will probably direct them to what to think. But if you're as old as me, the pivotal experiences were reading and imagining. So probably more than the current generation, people of my age had to employ their imaginations. Now that's a mixed blessing, because a lot of what was written and a lot of what continues to be written plays on your imagination. And then when you go and chase the facts down and the claims, and then you try and cross-reference the claims against other things, a lot of them aren't what they seem. I remember being totally awestruck at one point. I'd read about the Barney and Betty Hill abduction, and there's a mention in some book about, and the object was tracked on radar, and I was young enough to think, that's it then, it's proved. And then when you go and read Robert Schaefer's account of it, and you think, well, how far did that object go and how many radars could have tracked it? And it was only one, and actually it was one radar. The only anomalous trace at the same time was a radar on an airfield, and it was just a directional radar. It was a radar that basically tracked the incoming planes to figure out the distance between the incoming plane and the runway. Literally that, just measuring it. So it's much more likely that radar picked up a swarm of insects, actually, than the UFO that they were claiming to see much higher in the sky. But I mean, the pivotal experiences for me were about in those early days just reading about stuff, because you could do that more than you'd ever see it on TV. This is way before, you know, wall-to-wall media in all forms. I would say it was just using my imagination, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. And you've been doing a lot of podcasts lately.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a lot of some press coverage actually over in the UK about some of that. Can you tell me what's going on over there in the UK?
What, with regard to press coverage of my book, or with regard to UFOs?
Well, let's start with the UFOs and then lead it into your book.
Okay, well, so I would say we're not having a particularly stunning time of it at the moment. There are two things that are going on in the UK with regard to UFOs, which are probably more specific to this time. The first one is that we're probably in a period at the moment where, you'll be aware of this, sometimes ufologists kind of turn on each other, and there's lively debate, to say the least, about who you can trust and who you can't. Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a mild swearing alert. There's a bit of a shitstorm to do with there's a quite a famous ufologist in the UK, a guy called Nick Pope, who's, you know, become quite well known. But there's, in the last year, a website has appeared called Nick Pope Watch, and nobody knows who's put it up. And it's pretty much a demolition of a lot of his claims about his background and himself and everything like that. So sadly, a lot of it at the moment is about, it's almost like entrenched camps battling with each other about who you can and can't trust. And I've had contact lately with Bufora, who used to be a massive organisation, and it's down to very, very little at the moment. Now, that said, the other thing that's going on is, of course, is that reports continue to come in, and a lot of them, because we're not in a point of hysteria at the moment, a lot of them are quite random and very sincere and quite strange. And so the people I'm involved with, who are still processing UFO reports and trying to investigate them, have probably got a more varied and eclectic bunch of reports than they've seen in a long time. I mean, it tends to be the case that when some big event, or some, like the Close Encounters movie, for example, 40 odd years ago in the UK, that was one of the biggest spikes we ever had in UFO claims coming in, and suddenly the world and his dog in this country were seeing greys, yeah, and all the others just disappeared. We seem to be going back to certainly a lot of the reports I've been involved in recently, people reporting things to me, have been one-off, unique, very strange experiences, you know, almost like surreal experiences. And it's interesting, because I know from talking to one or two other people who are involved in reports, they're noticing an increase in these as well. And I would love to say in a single sentence why that's happening, and I don't. I can't tell you, because I just don't know. I mean, I suspect possibly that it as a result of lockdowns and people living more isolated lives, if they're encountering something, they're experiencing it in a very personal way, more so than they used to 10 or 15 years ago. It's an interesting situation, Scott, because I've not known a time like it for those kind of reports, and we haven't had any kind of major mass sightings, or for me, same as the United States, that one thing that kept ufology, I mean, let's just agree that we can use the term ufology, that's a whole other can of worms, isn't it? But one thing that kept it going in the UK for a long time was that there were active research groups and quite a lot of conferences, and when you went to these, there was normally some hot case that people were investigating, and, you know, books were coming out about it. And at the moment, the ones that everybody's talking about, like we're all sharing, would be the same stuff that, you know, the infamous Pentagon videos and one or two of those cases. There's nothing driving it in the UK, and I think that's partly to do with lack of conferences, lack of people getting together, lack of sharing about this. So it's almost like it's become much more localized, which is, you know, interesting to say the least. And I mean, I have a particular take on this, which is that I think the kind of experiences I'm talking about, the random, surreal, very strange, you know, unquestionably sincere experiences that people have, they've always been there. They sometimes get kicked aside by the famous spectacular ones that sort of overtake the whole thing and become the celebrated darlings of the whatever mass media you're looking at, radio, television, whatever. So it's almost like we're down to the grassroots to a certain extent. That said, the conferences are all starting to happen again. I think I've been swapping emails about doing a talk to a group called ASAP, which is the Association for the Scientific Study of Anomalous Phenomena. They've got a conference in September in the city of Bath. And once we get back to that, everybody will start talking about the same things again. Then when they start talking about the same things, everybody will start seeing the same things again. And then we'll be back to normal. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder sometimes, this is the question that I kind of wanted to ask was, in order to gain, if someone is making up a story, and I'm not saying that most of these people are, but if you are, in order to get attention, you kind of have to make it a crazy story, right? If you come out and say the exact same thing everyone else is saying,
well, so I don't know, Scott, and I think there's a few threads that you could take off that. So it's very difficult to come up with a straight answer and say, well, that's right. Yes, absolutely. There is definitely something in a lot of the more celebrated cases where something starts off spectacularly, and then because that story does the rounds and it almost gets exhausted, in some cases, the key witnesses or whatever, just to keep themselves in the limelight, just seem to come up with more and more, don't they? And there are some, George Adamski was one such, Billy Meyer was another one, and I would respectfully suggest that a lot of people in the UFO community don't believe the things that they said, but they kept on saying them and they kept on doing more of the same. And one or two others. So I know in Robert Schaefer's book, Bad UFOs, he describes being at the event that's written up as the symposium at Indian Head, where a bunch of people got together, a bunch of significant people in the UFO community, including Betty Hill, got together to try and figure out, decades after the event, what had actually happened with the Betty and Barney Hill sighting. And Robert Schaefer describes in this that it was going great until Betty Hill got up to present, and she overran her time by about 100%, so she was twice as long, and a lot of it was just these blurry pictures of lights in the sky, which she's claiming all kinds of stuff, and he describes it as quite an uncomfortable experience, really, almost like an insight into somebody who couldn't stop seeing UFOs. Now, she's not every witness, let's be completely clear about this, right?
Right.
But I think what you're describing, where sometimes it keeps on generating itself, there are people who have that propensity, and some of them are quite sincere, but they're if you and I were in the same place with them, however much we want to believe, we might not see the UFOs they're seeing. I mean, there's a story I do tell on a few podcasts and stuff, and so no names or details here because it's unfair on the witness, but I had dealings in a UFO research group a while ago with somebody who was having fairly regular sightings, and these involved lights in the sky that were trying to give her a message, basically, and just to do with the place that the sightings were often taking place. It wasn't any remote location. It was where what we call a motorway, where what you call a freeway, met another major road. So two dual carriageways colliding over a big roundabout. So if you stood there at any one time, you'd see thousands of cars an hour go past here. So why are they not all getting the same message? And I went and did a private, unofficial investigation. I never reported this back to the research group I was in because it seemed a bit cruel to do so. But it just so happened there was a filling a petrol station near there. You could pull in and stand and have a look at it. And I would have put my mortgage at that point on the fact that she was seeing planes coming into a nearby airport. It was just obvious. You could just do with the way the planes approached the airport with the landing lights on. And of course they weren't going. They were coming down, so they would appear and then they would disappear to do with the way the land lay and everything. So the lights would disappear. Now, people like her have always been involved in the UFO community. Their experiences are completely sincere. I don't believe she was seeing spaceships, basically. But that doesn't mean I disbelieve every witness I've ever met. Yeah, and
Right.
there are
Yep.
some stories I would not even want to try and explain away rationally because I don't think we know enough, but they're very intriguing.
What do you think about Roswell and some of the other huge cases, Rendlesham Forest, things like that? So let's start with Roswell. What's your take on Roswell?
Well, so when I explain I'll explain it slightly differently to how I did on podcast UFO or with John Hagedorn, because I think it was the second or the third person that rang in after podcast UFO. The word he used to describe me was moron.
Uh,
No,
we have nice fans over here. So.
Everywhere, Scott, but it's so I could bang on or I could keep it quite simple. I have because I'd say I'm more skeptical, and I like to apply critical thinking where I can, and my whole background, without boring you with my career, is that academia, more the nearest thing I ever had to a full-time job, and I spent decades teaching university students, so it's the whole critical thinking thing is hardwired. And because of that, I think partly I struggle with both of those as literal cases. Roswell, so I'm suspicious of a lot of the claims, and we could go into all the details, or I could simply point out this, that one thing that I notice about a lot of what's reported to this day about Roswell is that certain investigations and certain research is just ignored all the time. And the thing that I don't see mentioned ever really on the popular accounts is Carl Flock's book about Roswell. Now this is significant because Carl Flock he got money from a thing called the Fund for UFO Research, right? You can Google all this, there's Wikipedia pages about it, really easy to find.
Right.
And the Fund for UFO Research didn't last that long, but it was mainly active at the end of the 20th century, and it gathered money for the reasons you would think. Yeah, the point was, let's have a whip round, let's get as much money as we can, let's put good researchers into these good cases, and we'll get the evidence that will convince the skeptical scientists and people like that. And the Fund for UFO Research never spent more money than it did on Roswell, and Carl Flock's book is the result. And he was there in 50 years after the case, basically, and it falls apart in front of him. So you don't even, as I keep saying at talks and stuff, you don't even need to read the book. If you held it and just opened the flyleaf, you're looking at a map, and it has 5 landing sites on it, including 3 that are ascribed to Frank Kaufman, who was one of the key witnesses at this point, right? And in the course of dealing with Carl Flock, who's investigating it, Frank Kaufman swore 3 affidavits, and predictably affidavit number 3 and affidavit number 2 said that the ones before them were rubbish. Yeah, right. So there's a problem with that, because I found some of the more credible witness, or the people I believed were credible earlier on, actually fall apart in front of Carl Flock. So Glenn Dennis, who was the mortician who claimed it, I thought his story was quite credible, because he wasn't claiming anything particularly spectacular. He said basically that he was asked to deliver child-sized coffins to the base at Roswell, which was unusual, but he was a mortician and he worked in a funeral home, and occasionally strange requests did come in and they dealt with them. And then he goes to see his girlfriend, who's a nurse at the facility. He pulls up at the medical building at Roswell, and he goes in to try and find her. She's horrified to see him and just goes ballistic and drives him out of there and tells him to get out, he's in danger. And then when they meet up in the town later on for a drink, she says, well, you shouldn't have been there. What was going on in that building was that we were doing an autopsy on a dead alien, right? And he even names her. Now, Carl Flock, probably Glenn Dennis didn't expect this to happen, but Carl Flock had the money to go looking he just researched it basically chased it down until it fell apart in front of him. That nurse never existed. Yeah, and so my problem with Roswell and a lot of these big cases is that they just fall apart in front of you, and they often demonstrate the same things, that at heart there seems to be a story that's credible, and you could say that certain things happened without a doubt. The more people that come on board, the more they start to contradict each other, and the more, if you actually use a spreadsheet to put the details together, the more there are little contradictions or just doubts all the way along the line. I mean, a simple thing with Roswell which Carl Flock points out, is that a lot of the descriptions of certain places and certain things that happened are just provably false. The medical building at Roswell that people describe in the eyewitness accounts does not tally with the photographs. It's the actual building was much more a prefabricated structure, much smaller than is described. Yeah, and so I have a problem with those in that I don't doubt that people come forward with unusual stories, but certainly the big ones, and my decades of sort of involvement in this, ufology has produced a number of spectacularly successful cases that have spawned books, and they've been celebrated at conferences. And if somebody was coming into it new, they wouldn't know about this, but they can Google them, and you just, and the MJ12 documents, the Botswana sky crash, Roswell to a certain extent, if you look at them, some of these great cases that were going to change the world have just crashed and burned to the point where they're irretrievable now. Yeah, the alien autopsy, for example. So the last proper big UFO conference I went to, Stelios, I can't pronounce his second name, it's like a Greek Cypriot second name, but he's one of the two special effects guys who faked it. This is the point, and he now does the rounds explaining how he did it and bad mouthing Ray Santilli, who's still making money off the video regardless of the fact that it's disproven. Unreal. So sorry, I'm rambling all around, but I have a problem with some of the big cases in that I think that if you strip them down, you often see the same pattern. You see certain facts that are provably true, which are enigmatic and a bit strange, and they're not easy to explain, at which point a whole big story gets spun around them, and then it grows just organically because certain people come on board to claim things, which means therefore I'm a little bit distrustful of these big cases. And I'm sorry, but where Roswell's concerned, I actually think I believe the Project Mogul thing. I find that the most credible, because another one of the books, which has got 3 authors, which again is never mentioned when they're the kind of more spectacular documentaries are trying to sell themselves to TV. There's a book with 3 authors called The Making of UFO Crash at Roswell, The Making of a Modern Myth. One of the 3 authors is a guy called Charles Moore, who went on to have a very significant scientific career. But just coincidentally, Charles Moore was a research student who worked on Project Mogul, right? Now, I struggled through his section of the book because bloody hell, he knows a thing or two about neoprene balloons, yeah? And more than you'll ever need to know. But I find it very convincing, and the story he tells is actually amazing, but it gets lost in the Roswell thing. Project Mogul was a top secret project. The point was to spy on the Russians using high-level balloons, right? And it was part of a kind of intelligence arms race. How quickly could we spy on the Russians with their nuclear tests? So it was going up against things that were more promising, like high-altitude spy planes, right? The main reason Project Mogul never went into mass use was that the U-2 spy plane beat it and was more effective. But they went from, in just a bit more than 3 years, from launching balloons that more or less crashed in sight on the eastern seaboard of America to the last flights. One of them came down in Norway. This was launched in America, right? So that's the whole Atlantic Ocean, and it's overflying the north end of Britain. And another one came down, I think, in Tunisia. Like, it got all the way from the USA to Africa, Wow. And this was to do with, Charles Moore tells you this story in this book, this little regarded book, but obviously as a researcher on that, he understood what they were doing. It was about, using the lifting power of trains of balloons. And I find that much more convincing. And Rendlesham Forest, I'm off on one now. Okay. I'll keep the Rendlesham rant a little shorter, because I'm a bit of an outlier on Rendlesham Forest. I'm one of about 4 people I know who believes what I'm about to tell you. But anyway, Rendlesham Forest is more or less the same thing. There's loads of military witnesses. Has the same profile as Roswell. It's a fantastic cover-up case where aliens and contact with extraterrestrial civilizations was involved. When you strip it down, the key eyewitnesses who've gone into print have similarities, but they don't agree with each other. There are various landing sites, albeit if you go to Rendlesham Forest, you can get to all the landing sites within a matter of minutes, whereas Roswell, a helicopter or a jeep would be quite handy, yeah, right? Yeah. But you can more or less see one from the other at Rendlesham, and it's literally well, it was either in that field out there, as Larry Warren claims, or it was in this bit of the forest here, you know, as Jim Penniston claims. But actually, I have a suspicion about this. When you go to Rendlesham Forest, there's now a UFO trail. The local forestry people, actually, there's a trail you can walk in the forest, right? And it goes from, well, you pull into a car park, so you actually have to walk the trail starting in the middle, more or less. But if you walked it from how it's supposed to work, from the east gate of the base, which it's an air base and it opens out into the forest. So if your listeners aren't familiar with this, the claim is that over a number of nights, a couple of nights, American airmen on British soil encountered UFOs, basically, and possibly aliens, right? And that there may well have been a landing. But actually, if you walk out from the east gate to the supposed landing site, you walk east to the edge of the forest, and this is significant, and then you're overlooking a field, right? My suspicion, to be honest with you, is that the whole thing covers probably a fairly minor but potentially very damaging mishap that the American military had, because it's just to do with my hunch about this, and there's no documentary evidence to prove this, is that if you look at where the east gate of the base is, and then you look at where the supposed landing site is, it's the closest place you could launch a cruise missile without it hitting the trees. Yeah, so there's a whole bit of British history that applies to this, but in the 1980s, we were what NATO there's a book about it called The Unsinkable Aircraft Carrier. The defence significance of Britain was NATO, particularly America, had forces in our country, right, to repel the threat from Russia. And one key part of that defence were cruise missiles, which were missiles which could have nuclear warheads, which you could launch off a mobile launcher. So the beauty of these from a military point of view was that if there was an incoming strike that was going to level the base, you still had a warning. You could get these missiles out to designated launch sites. The launch sites, there was a number of launch sites. The selection of those would be randomized any day. So you couldn't ever know on a given day where the missiles would go to fire back. But if there was an incoming strike from Russia, it was mutually assured destruction. They would get, even if they flattened us, they would get something back. And this was great, but it was, in this country, it was hugely controversial, and there were people protested against it, massively protested against it. And this all kicked off in the early 1980s. The Rendlesham Forest incident is just before that. So just a guess, probably nothing more significant than they might have had a mobile launcher or something on the base. And it's interesting that the first night of the encounter is 26th of December, what we call Boxing Day in this country. You've got a different name in America, haven't you? I can't.
Yeah,
They have after Christmas Day, but anyway, it's then. And the entire base, it was Christmas party night on the base. It had the lowest security staffing of any night of the year, right? If you were going to do something secret, you'd handpick the guys who were either so dedicated you could convince them away from a party, or they just have no friends and they don't want to be at the party anyway, right? But you only need 2 or 3 of these guys. And it's like, right, okay, you're going to do something, you can't talk about it, at which point it's like, you know, they wheel this launcher out and they're looking like, shit, what's that, you know? And I'm not suggesting for a second there was a missile on it, but assuming that it was just simply a test drill, and it's like, let's go from the east gate of the base to the edge of the wood. That's where the UFO trail suggests that they went to chase the UFOs. If something went wrong, mechanical mishap, or it just got stuck in the mud, they've got a problem. They've got to get this thing back, because if it's seen, officially it doesn't exist, right? It's even before the agreement to have the cruise missiles, right? But at that point, back to the facts, it is indisputable that the local police were called out. Local residents, British civilians, saw strange lights in the forest, which is why the police were called out. They suspected poachers, right? As in, you know, guys illegally killing animals to eat them, right? And that definitely happened. So I'm sorry, but for me, it just seems like a kind of pragmatic thing, really, that maybe there was nothing more to it than there was a bit of a mishap with a bit of secret military equipment. Lights and men were needed urgently to get this thing back in before it was widely seen. That explains what the people on the ground saw, the British civilians. The rest maybe a cover story, and it wouldn't be. UFO and alien cover stories have probably been used in the past to draw attention away from secret military projects. I mean, there's a last point on this. Another question, but when the Russians were coming into Hungary in 1956, the Hungarian crown jewels were spirited out of Hungary, and they spent a few years at Fort Knox, right, in Texas. And the subsequent operation was declassified. Jimmy Carter gave them back in 1978, and they've been in Hungary since then. But the military operation was quite unusual. They got them back. They handpicked a military team, and unusually they stayed with the cargo all the way from Budapest to Fort Knox. The same guys got on a ship at Bremerhaven in Germany, sailed all the way back to the United States, and stayed with the cargo to Fort Knox in Texas. Wait a minute, where's Fort Knox, Texas, Kentucky? I can't remember. Oh, it's America's top bullion depository, isn't it? There's more gold per square foot than, yeah. Anyway, but that's where the Hungarian crown jewels went, and so it was an unusual mission, and the soldiers were told that they were guarding the, in inverted commas, the wings and engine of a flying saucer. Now, clearly, eventually that story was declassified, because when Jimmy Carter gave it back, the Americans had nothing more to hide, so they made it public knowledge that the crown of St. Stephen, which from insurance purposes is priceless, near as makes no odds, had been in America all that time. But obviously when the Hungarians became more of a Western looking friendly communist power, they got their crown jewels back, and the guys who, if they were still around, that had been guarding in inverted commas the wings and engine of a flying saucer, knew what was really in the crate.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you on Roswell and Rendlesham. I think, when I first looked into Roswell, I was like, you see the headline in the paper, Army finds crashed flying saucer, or, and at first it looks like it's a lock, right? Like this really happened. But yeah, the more you look into it, and the more people that talk about it and tell their stories, same with Rendlesham, it gets very confusing. And you really don't know who to believe or what's going on. And I do like your point that Roswell and Rendlesham Forest, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, they very well could have just been cover-ups for military actions, like you said. The balloons. I believe that could definitely be a case. The only thing about that I don't understand is why they wouldn't just go retrieve the crashed balloon rather than waiting for a farmer to find it, and then.
Well, they wouldn't know where it was. So this is 1947, right? So it's not like radar is so good that they know exactly where it's come down. And according to Charles E. Moore in his section on that book on the making of a modern myth to do with Roswell, they were getting better with the Project Mogul balloons, but obviously it was still early days, so they had a rough idea, but they were trying to find this in the middle of the desert, and then on top of that, Matt Brazel found it anyway, right? And if you believe that kind of more mundane view of it, then it's quite simple, really. That let's just go off on a. Sorry,
no, it's fine.
To tell me when to shut up, but there's a few other relevant things here that I would throw into the mix, really. It's almost like if the proponents of Roswell being like a UFO crash can explain everything that I'm going over, then I'd love to be wrong on this. But so Mac Brazel found this debris anyway, right? And I know you're right. When you read all the books, the different timings go in, they don't always agree with each other and everything. But crudely, Mac Brazel found it in June, but he didn't take it to Sheriff Proctor until he was next visiting Roswell, because the Brazel Ranch is quite a long way out of Roswell anyway. So it would be quite an undertaking just to take a bit of random stuff that you'd found you couldn't explain. So it was much later that he did that. And he couldn't explain what he'd found, but then he went back, and the story that gets told repeatedly is that Jesse Marcel then went with him, the intelligence officer from the Roswell base. Jesse Marcel went out with him and was bemused by this stuff he was finding, and it's Jesse Marcel's story that does the rounds now, isn't it, about how, you know, these fragments were super strong and you bent them and they'd bend themselves back into shape and these hieroglyphics made no sense and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And everybody forgets that Jesse Marcel was one of 3 people who went that day, right? So Mac Brazel, Jesse Marcel and Sheridan Cabot, who was a military officer with Jesse Marcel. Now, Cabot was still alive when Carl Flock did his book. And his story is, he stayed true to his story the whole time. He never doubted for 1 second they were gathering up balloon fragments and some other random things he didn't know, but there was no question in his mind about whether they were extraterrestrial. Yeah. And the claim about Project Mogul is that it's an odd thing. It's very high tech in terms of the balloons, but it's very low tech in terms of some of the other stuff. You know, we're talking like strong sticky tape and, you know, whatever, because it's got to be lightweight, hasn't it? It's ultimately you want something strong and lightweight, because the point of this is to get these balloons into the upper atmosphere, harness the jet stream. And the reason that the military didn't find it is, like I say, because they didn't have blanket radar coverage at the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, and they would cut balloons. They'll come down where, you know, where there are so many random things working on them. So that kind of explains it. And just another point about, because I mentioned earlier on about, obviously I grew up reading whatever you could lay your hands on, like in terms of UFO books and stuff, and most of them have been published in America. So even in the UK, the bulk of the books you bought were American. One significant factor people forget about Roswell is that it's just nowhere in the literature until the Charles Berlitz book, right? Now that's interesting. The Walter Haut press release, absolutely no doubt. The local newspaper in Roswell printed a story, you know, and many rumors about the flying disc, yada yada. That press release from Walter Haut definitely went out from the base, and yet apparently no UFO researcher found it until much later. Now again, this may or may not be significant. The story went mega when Jesse Marcel went to the National Enquirer in, I think, 1978, right? Now, this is significant because in the 1970s, the National Enquirer were prepared to pay $100,000 to anybody with a UFO story that would provably get out there and settle these mysteries, basically, right? And if you think about it now, I mean, the National Enquirer, that would have been a bargain. If the National Enquirer got an exclusive drop on the things that the Washington Post couldn't get, right?
Yeah.
So they became a magnet for a bunch of people who were trying to convince them with stories, and that's when Jesse Marcel went there. And that's how he ended up with Charles Berlitz, who'd just written a best-selling book about the Bermuda Triangle, right? But again, Berlitz is an interesting character because his Bermuda Triangle book they don't really hold up, you know. Yeah. I remember seeing him interviewed in the 1970s for a BBC documentary, and he was evasive, shall we say, about, you know, oh, I got this fact from this person, I got this fact from this person, and actually when they went to the original sources, it's like, no, you didn't, you know. And but he sold a lot of books. I'm not knocking him for that. But you know, again, I think that's significant that the story took off when he went to the National Enquirer and told them a great story. Some of the people who could have contradicted him at that point were still alive. Sheridan Cabot never changed his story. He was with Jesse Marcel picking up the wreckage, and he didn't believe, and he never said that he picked up anything extraterrestrial. So for all those reasons, Scott, I'm struggling with it. As a, you know, it's a great story, but frankly, there are much better, more intriguing cases, and I think it's a bit of a, was it Philip Klass described it as a boil on the ass of ufology, or John Keel? I can't remember, one of those two.
I'm terrible with names, but I remember the saying.
But one of the two more entertaining skeptical people, but neither of whom was that skeptical completely. They both had, you know, they both believed that there were intriguing answers to things. But one of those two described Roswell as a boil on the ass of ufology, basically, as in this case is so big, so distracting, it's doing us no favors in the long run. Yeah.
Yeah. What are some of the ones? What are some of the cases that you kind of hold in a higher regard than Roswell and some of the other
Well,
ones? They may be bigger cases that maybe not many of us Americans have heard of, or
yeah,
I don't know. But
so from my point of view, and having dissed the Holy Grail here, yeah, well, people who say, well, oh, you're so skeptical. That's just, the basically, I'm just, I don't get on board with a lot of the things that other people believe. So people often react negatively to that. I'm really intrigued with cases that don't fall apart. So, for your American audience, when my book came out, I was asked to do a top 10 of British cases, basically, which played very well when I was talking to the local press in the UK and stuff. And I think there's an amazing case from the UK that's not particularly well known in the US, and I put it as number one. So if your viewers were going to Google it, the 9th of November 1979. It happened in a place near Livingstone in Scotland. It's easy to find. It's known these days as the Deckmart Woods case. And that's because the book written about it by a guy called Malcolm Robinson is called The Deckmart Woods Encounter. And Malcolm Robinson, who's still around, and I used to see him occasionally because he lived near me, but he's moved back to Scotland now. He used to talk about it and whatever. And he was a young investigator at the point, and it's a really intriguing case, and I wouldn't want to tell you what happened. There was a forester, a guy called Bob Taylor, who went to a forest, the place that he worked, basically. He just went to work up in a forest, and it's in the middle of Scotland. I mean, as in literally sort of central to Scotland. And he, as he went into the forest, he saw like a craft hovering in front of him. But it was really like a strange encounter with this thing, because it was coming in and out of view, almost like it was fading in and fading out. So there were times he could see right through it. And then two smaller objects detached themselves from this and came towards him, and they just basically grabbed him. It's like he was being dragged. And then he lost consciousness and he came to, and he was on his own. He was in a really kind of, agitated state. He was mentally confused. It was as if he'd had a bit of a beating up. And whenever it's portrayed on television in this country, they always film it like in a remote forest location and stuff. But the place that it actually happened is it's a bit bizarre. If you're there and you photograph it, it looks like a remote forest. In reality, it isn't. It's very close to where Bob Taylor lived. And it just so happens that while it's a forest, there's a motorway. The main motorway across the middle of Scotland goes very nearby. So Bob Taylor did not, despite the fact that he couldn't get his pickup truck away, he tried to drive home, and he was in such a state he ran it into a ditch and it got stranded. So he ended up staggering home. Now, one of the reasons that this is, for my money, is an amazing case is what happened afterwards. Because he got home, albeit in a bit of a mess, very quickly after this happened, and his wife saw him, and she knew immediately that there was something wrong, and she treated it as if, she didn't know what had happened, but she treated it as if it was a serious incident. So the doctor and the police were called very quickly. So he was examined by a doctor. I don't know exactly how long, but it's within about an hour or so of it actually happening. Yeah. And it's a small community, so everybody knew each other. So the police were there very quickly. And in both cases, the doctor and the policeman, he knew them reasonably well. And what's useful then in regard to this is that the police, without knowing what the hell they were dealing with, treated it as an assault. Yeah.
okay.
These are pretty strange muggers, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say so.
We'll come flying through the air out of a UFO and take your money, But so one of the things, and this is why it's such a good case to this day, that the police took his clothes and they did forensic analysis on them. Now, they didn't find any strange substances on the clothes, but there's something really odd about his trousers. They were torn. And not only that, but the trousers were torn. These are like heavy forester trousers, which were the same trousers that the Scottish police wore, actually, because it's bloody cold up there. So they're really heavy, thick trousers, right? So you couldn't just it's not like you could just grab them and tear them like a piece of paper. But the tears in the trousers go upwards. It's as if something's come into the trousers and lifted him, right? And there's only a few of them. I mean, no word of a lie, Scott. Those trousers are the holy relic of British ufology, yeah? It's a rite of initiation. If you're a British ufologist, you've got to have your hands in the kecks at some point, right? I had my encounter with the trousers in Sheffield about 30 years ago, and Malcolm, who's the guy that wrote the book about it, he owns the trousers now. But because Bob Taylor was seen by a doctor very quickly, and there was no doubt he'd got minor abrasions, you know, along the lines of like if somebody had roughed you up a bit. And the police did the whole forensic job on his clothing and everything like that. So, and they got some evidence. I mean, what explains that that's another question. And one other thing I think that's really good about this case is that virtually nobody else has come forward. It's not like it's had all the hangers on, you know, where three people will come forward later on and say, well, I just happened to be you know, he didn't see me, but I was there. And there's none of that. And fair play to Malcolm, who wrote the book about it. I mean, you should get him on. He's worth a, you know, he's worth a shot. He's not hard. I'll put you in touch with him later on if we finished, if you want. But and he can tell you more about this. But he's got over a dozen possible scenarios at the end of his book. So he's not taking sides. He's basically saying these are all plausible explanations. The evidence supports them in this way, and it doesn't support them in the other way. So it's possible the entire thing happened in Bob Taylor's head. One thing that is intriguingly useful to support that is that the things that came off the UFO, when you see his description of them and then you see them created as pictures off the description, they look like the sea mines, the mines that used to float in the sea in World War II. And that's significant because Bob Taylor, his World War II service was in the Navy. And apart from anything else, if you were in the Navy and you were, you know, they were your greatest danger. Yeah. You could be having a calm day at sea. If one of those things hit your ship, you might be going down, right? So sailors knew what they looked like. So it's possible the whole thing happened in his head and he had some kind of hallucinatory experience. It's possible that he was caused to hallucinate by psychedelic fungus that was in the, and he'd encountered this without knowing it. And there are cases of that where, you know, people get it on their fingers and, you know, there's other cases where people go and harvest it and take it home and have a really good trip, you know. But
there you go.
but to put it bluntly, if Bob Taylor was tripping and he didn't know it, you know, a lot of the other bets are off, aren't they? Yeah. But I mean, who knows? And the police couldn't explain it. I mean, technically speaking, he was assaulted, but the assailants would be like no assailants that the Scottish police have ever encountered before or since. Yeah. You know, and that's an amazing case. Another one that that I talk about quite a bit. I've got, when I do my live talks, I've got a slide of this guy, a bloke called Alfred Berthoud, who was in 1983 was fishing by a canal in the middle of the night, in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the night in near a place called Aldershot, and he saw a UFO land, and a couple of beings came within sight but stood at a distance from him and beckoned him aboard it, and he got on board this thing, and he couldn't see any other living entity around, but a voice spoke to him and asked him how old he was, and he pointed out that he was coming up to his 78th birthday, and the voice said back to him, well, you're too old and infirm for our purposes, and he just walked away and went back fishing apparently. And then he saw it take off later on, and the only reason the case became known, he went to the local paper to report this, and he was really looking for anybody in the area who'd seen anything that would corroborate it, and nobody came forward to say that. And because this was like about 3 o'clock in the morning in August, and you know, the case has been explained as a hoax, but he died not long after that. His wife outlived him by a few years, and she was adamant that there was no way he'd made this up. And he'd had an interesting life. I mean, he'd been in the army, he'd been in really tough spots in the army. He'd been out in Canada, and he'd hunted and trapped animals. So he was no stranger to something scary. You know, he'd been in places that other people would have run away from. But that's an amazing case. Now, I find cases, to be brutally honest with you, Scott, I find cases, those are the cases I find a lot more interesting because they're very difficult to explain in any rational way. They could lead us to any one of a number of answers, which suggests to me that we're not even far enough down the road yet to be sure about the questions we're asking. So if you like, that's one of the things that kind of keeps me. I'm not skeptical about the fact that people have bizarre experiences that change their lives and completely change their perceptions of things. I think I differ from a lot of people who are interested in UFOs in the sense that I seriously think we're nowhere near close enough to be able to ask very intelligent questions about this yet. I think that we still, we almost leap on the obvious answers and we do a lot of confirmation bias in the way that we go about it. But cases like the two I've just described to you there suggest to me that there's any number of possible answers, but we can't easily dismiss these things we can't just dismiss them as figments of people's imagination. They may be, but if they are, they're caused by complicated circumstances that we need to understand. Yeah.
It's very interesting. I do tend to believe the one-offs more than the continual visitations. But I've, to my knowledge, never been abducted or even close to that. But it's certainly a possibility because I've had so many, encounters and been so close to a few of these UFOs that I don't know. It's possible, but there's a really strange story in your book about a doll's head. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So, can I say something about the one-off, Scott?
Sure.
Yeah. Because I think I'm with you totally. I believe the one-offs as well. You and me both, right? But I have a take on this that might be a little bit different to a lot of people that you'll interview. My belief is, if you like, that what we're looking at when we look at the most perplexing experiences that people come up with, we are looking probably at something that fits patterns, plural, more than one pattern. We are looking at, if we understood certain phenomena better, we'd actually see that a lot of these cases fall into one pattern or another. And I think the danger is sometimes that we focus on the specifics of a story and what people experience. And we experience them as one-offs, but they may not be. And I mean, if I could direct you, again, your viewers, your listeners, to one or two things that might put that into context. I think in 1907, William James wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. He was the first guy that kind of codified mystical experiences. And he comes up with 4 rules about what makes a proper mystical experience. And what's interesting is that they fit a lot of the one-off UFO encounters. They're transient, you don't go looking for them. They're what's called noetic. In other words, some knowledge is passed or possibly gained as a result of it. Yeah. And they're also uncanny, that they're very difficult to explain. They have this curious combination of being almost impossible and yet making a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of people who have one-off experiences, that's a common experience to them. Now, the interesting thing about William James' take on this, of course, he wrote this in 1907. So he's really talking about mystical religious experiences, or those odd occasions when people met nature spirits or something. But what's interesting for me is that with a lot of the more bizarre UFO encounters, his crude model fits the same thing. So it's almost like what we're talking about. It could just be part of the human experience, or it might be, if you want to go more cosmic than that, it might be, there may be some greater intelligence trying to communicate with us, and this is just the middle ground. At which point, they're not one-offs, they're just manifestations of the same thing. Yeah. Maybe. I don't know, right? Let's go back to the doll's head. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the doll's head is kind of relevant in a way to this, because this is a story that it's absolutely true. I mean, I haven't met this guy, but the person who told it to me is absolutely impeccable. The guy that told me this was a guy called Bob Rickard, who was one of the editors of the Fortean Times for a long, long time, and we were just discussing bizarre, reports and stuff. And he'd had dealings with somebody who, like a medical professional, who'd met a person who had a doll's head. And what they used to do with the doll's head was they used to boil it, swallow it, pick it up after it had passed through them, and repeat the experience again and again and again, right?
Oh, wow.
Now, yeah. Now, the point of this is, it's not, I mean, this is not a UFO experience, but the point of this is that it's a really good example of how the most bizarre, surreal things become meaningful to some people, yeah? And I can't remember the name of the doctor, but I remember seeing something ages ago about this conversation I was talking to Bob about. It started because they just printed something in the Fortean Times about, there's a guy, I think it was a proctologist in Israel. So he basically is a doctor who deals with your rear end, yeah, right? And he had a black museum, this guy, which was just full of objects he'd retrieved from the back passages of his patients, yeah? And it was just like, when you looked at it, it was like, what? Really? I mean, all those things, yeah? And it wasn't the one patient, but the point being, it's like, some of them might have been there accidentally, most of them weren't. And you think, well, what the hell are these people thinking, you know? And the human condition is almost beyond, you know, we agree on a lot of things when we're out in public, but actually the experience of medical professionals, or, you know, psychiatric professionals and stuff, people who deal with humanity, sometimes that there are just such idiosyncratic things going on in people's minds. They meet one-offs all the time, and it's part of the human condition. So I think, again, some of that bizarre, surreal creativity that we might do out of awareness sometimes contributes to the UFO stories we read, certainly some of the more bizarre ones, Scott. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy right there.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd be swallowing that thing. That's maybe if I was the first one, but
I don't, I mean, but that's the thing, you know. At what point do you find yourself looking at a doll's head thinking, I must swallow that?
yeah. Well,
Exactly. I mean, you know, it's a leveler, isn't it? You know, I could reach over there and I could put some music on that would clear a room, right? Yeah. But that's about the limit of where I'd go with, you know, and that makes sense to me. But you know, doll's heads and stuff. But you know, we're all, for one reason or another, we all have our kind of, you know, we end up with our own little kind of quirks and interests and stuff. And I think, I seriously think sometimes with the paranormal tales, just in general, not just ufology, that we encounter, you know, there are little surreal corners of people's imagination that feed this sometimes, to the point where they experience things in a different way. Yeah. And,
yeah.
you know, we don't know it until it's reported or it's in front of us. Yeah. Which is, you know, which is how come a medical professional ends up taking something out of somebody's rear end. Yeah. And presumably, you know, presumably the conversation at that point is like, what the hell are you doing with this stuck up there? And it's like, well, the first 23 times it came out, you know.
Yeah, right. Aliens are the resident proctologists from other universes. They
Well,
come here to
well,
practice
yeah.
on us, right? No.
But compared to some of the things that people do to each other, our encounters with aliens might be some of the more mundane stories. Yeah.
Right. True. Very true. Very true.
I mean, let me just, your listeners and your viewers might, if they're unfamiliar with this story, they might want to Google it. There are definitely, from the way I look at it, there are definitely one or two of the more celebrated UFO stories that would indicate that things go on in people's minds. So it's either some flight of fancy in your mind, or it's some cosmic consciousness messing with you. But either way, we go into places where we experience something real that other people don't. And one of the best UFO cases that would indicate that, in my humble opinion, is the Eagle Rock encounter. Is it the Joe Simonton and his pancakes from about 60 years ago? I don't know if you're familiar with that one. No?
Not
No?
particularly.
Worth a Google. Yes, the main witness was a guy called Joe Simonton. He encountered a UFO. There were beings in the UFO, but amongst other things, they were cooking pancakes in there, as you do. Yeah, right. and they
Okay.
gave him a pancake. So when he reported the encounter later on, he had a fragment of this alien cooked pancake, right? And there's photographs online of him holding it up. And of course it was examined, and it's a pancake. I mean, absolutely no evidence that it's alien. But there's not, he didn't do that to become notable. It wasn't a publicity seeking thing.
Okay.
You know, the people dealing with him encountered a sincere witness. Now, again, I'm really interested in cases like that because I actually think that they probably lead us to understanding how some of these experiences come about. I wouldn't want to put money on whether he initiated the whole thing accidentally, i.e. almost in some kind of weird imagining of his mind. Oh, you know, like maybe like some kind of, well, one of the theories about Bob Taylor as well is that he had a small ischemic stroke, basically. So, you know, he was in one of these kind of states between waking and dreaming, yeah? And so what he experienced was sincere, but if you or I had been watching him, we wouldn't have seen the same thing. And Joe Simonton might have been that animal, but it's an interesting case. And the history of UFO research is dotted with strange cases like that, where there is evidence up to and including physical evidence, like in Joe Simonton's case. There's no question the pancake existed. As to how it came into being, you know, yeah. But if the aliens gave it to him, they cooked a very ordinary earthbound pancake on a flying saucer. That's basically what happened. Yeah.
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 Well, I've heard of cases of abductions where people are actually in like full furnished rooms, you know, with flat screen TVs and shag carpet or whatever. And that kind of stuff is crazy, you know. It's almost like they want to see how we're gonna react if they just kind of put us somewhere. Wes Roberts, I think, was the person that was talking about that.
Yeah. Well, I met somebody, again, this was sort of something that was reported to me, and the person wasn't looking for any kind of publicity, but the gist of it was that they were in quite a public place. They were it's in the UK. They were in a very, if you'd been there, it was a remote area. They were surrounded by greenery and trees and everything like that, but they saw a cloud open. Like they were looking at a cloud and it opened as if like the center of the cloud was almost like theater curtains that just opened wide. And what they saw inside the cloud was a kind of like a metallic structure, like the cloud had got a steel frame inside it, almost like it was a constructed, and then the whole thing closed up again and it went back to being a normal cloud. Yeah. And just doing the basic maths on this, although this person experienced it alone, i.e. they couldn't see anybody else around them and they were just looking at the cloud, given where it happened, first of all, the cloud was so high that it's improbable that they were the only person to see it. Secondly, given where it happened, the cloud would, if there was a metal structure in the middle of a cloud, air traffic control would have known about it. And one thing this witness did not describe to me was suddenly, like, you know, 4 or 5 RAF jets come piling in to see what the hell was going on, which would have, you know, would have, and given where this happened, it would have been, it's near the sea, but it's in a rural area. You know, it would have, you would scramble jet fighters if there was an unknown craft coming in. Yeah. But that's with the flat screen TVs, and I can't, without going and dragging a book off the shelf and looking at the little note in it. I remember reading somebody describing at one point finding a stone wall inside a UFO. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I don't know. You know, your common sense says people are having strange encounters, but this is going on in their head. Yeah. I mean, they clearly don't make UFOs the way that they make Buicks or Ford cars, do they? They're not all, you know, they're not all off the same production line, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, they could have special rooms and things they make for us that look like walls and things, but, you know, just to make us feel more comfortable. But, you know, yeah, it's very strange. And back to your book, you mentioned the British Ministry of Defense has some gun camera footage that is not very well known.
Okay, not publicly shown ever, no. So and I don't want to get involved in the whole British debate about, you know, Nick Pope, who's who's ex-Ministry of Defence, but
Yeah.
one point I would make is that there have been other people from the Ministry of Defence in the UK who've been involved in ufology, and I heard this story from a guy called Ralph Noyes. You won't find much about him on the internet. When I've been on podcasts before, and then I've had people contact me through my website and say, I googled him and I can't find him, and it's because they don't spell the name right.
Oh, okay.
You pronounce it Noise like the Foo Fighters on Full Throttle, right? But it's written like Noise, Noy for yellow, es, right? So that was his name, and he was, I can't remember where he was like rank wise in the Ministry of Defence. In fact, the internet can't agree on this. I've seen it reported that he was an air commodore, and I've seen it also reported that he retired as an under secretary. The point is, he was very senior in our Ministry of Defence, and anybody that would say to you, well, they don't, you know, they hush up UFOs and stuff. Ralph was in the UFO community in Britain at the end of the last century, and he was a very public figure. He'd talk at conferences, and I got to know him a little bit because he was in the same research group, which in a place in Essex, in just sort of near London. And he would tell anybody quite a few things. He was quite open about stuff. The way he looked at it, the Ministry of Defence was not hiding a huge amount, other than the fact that there were things that it didn't know. And he said that the Ministry of Defence had come to two conclusions very quickly, and they didn't change their mind readily about this. Number one, that there was definitely stuff out there they didn't understand that required investigation. Number two, that there was no evidence that it was extraterrestrial. But some of the more intriguing things he'd seen included some film, and in 1970, I think it was, he discussed the fact that him and a number of other senior personnel were told that their lunchtime was taken from them, and they were given a briefing and a show of slides, then like a projector, and you project still images on the wall and a few bits of film, and they were just shown the evidence that the Ministry of Defence hadn't shared, the most intriguing UFO evidence, the kind of money shot of which is a bit of gun camera film from, I think it's an RAF Lightning fighter, which would have been a cutting edge fighter of the late 60s. And it's just an anomalous object in the air, but it's whilst it's difficult to figure out what it is, it's a classic sort of orb UFO, but you know, it's definitely from an RAF fighter. It's definitely in the sky. They haven't a bloody clue what they're looking at. And the Ralph, as a desk-bound official, but with a need to know, was shown this. And I'm sure that other bits and pieces of that exist. I mean, whether the Pentagon videos that everybody's been getting excited about for the last year and a bit go into that
Tic Tac.
or what, I don't know. But the point I'm making there, if you like, is that there definitely is stuff. The people who've encountered it are less ready than you think to cover it up. I mean, Ralph was, like I say, he was in public sight for years. So by the time I met him, he was retired from the MOD, but he was very active in the UFO community. He would talk about quite a lot of things to do with the MOD, where clearly, if he'd been banned from saying things, then you'd have thought somebody would have dealt with him, because he was in plain sight. He was talking at conferences and he was attending research groups and stuff. And so clearly his former bosses knew what he was up to, because apart from anything else, he was publishing stuff. And in fact, he wrote an interesting book called A Secret Property, which is virtually impossible to get now. It's a novel. It's fiction, but it's pretty thinly disguised fiction, and it's blatantly about the Rendlesham forest case. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he discusses it as a secret military operation, right? His take on it isn't my take on it. It's much more complicated, his take on it, as to what's possible. But again, you'd think if the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, had any worries about it, at some point they'd have dealt with it, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
You know, he wasn't hard to find. He was at the same research group every Thursday night. If you wanted to just lift him, you'd just find him there every time. Yeah.
Yeah. Governments are, in my opinion, never going to tell us what they know. At least not the whole story. What are your opinions on the Nimitz and the Go Fast videos from the U.S. Navy? I mean, those are obviously they're real objects.
Mhm.
It's undeniable, but we don't know what they are. So
No.
in a way, that does prove that UFOs do exist. But I think that's probably about as far as they're going to go. I think if we're ever going to get the truth,
Mhm.
the whole truth and nothing but the truth,
Mhm.
we have to, we have to stand up to the governments, and we have to basically tell them that they're real, and we want the information, and we have to make it a priority. It's the only way it's ever going to happen, because at least here in the United States, the special access programs, the black budget stuff, it's all off the books. So the government, the elected officials, they don't know what we have. And when they try to get the information, they're told, you don't have access, you don't have a need to know, you know. You could bring in the highest ranked, Navy officer and send him to Area 51, and he can't get in. The president can't. No one can get in unless you have special access. And our military budget that we know of every year is about $750 billion to $850 billion a year for what? And that's just what we know about. Think of all the trickle down trillions of dollars that they've managed to steal through these black budget programs, and it's crazy. I wonder how far we are behind. I wonder if we've been able to duplicate any of the way that these UFOs fly, if we do truly have any of the technology, which I do find it hard to believe that UFOs crash, because it's talked about so often. We talked about Roswell. There's a lot of crash stories out there. There's supposedly crash retrieval teams that head out. I mean, how can you make it through the whole galaxy and then get to Earth and then decide I'm just gonna crash right into the ground?
Yeah.
I don't know about those. Of course, every case is separate, and I'm very much like you. Even though I've seen UFOs, and I have no doubt in my mind what I saw was there and was real in some form or another. It wasn't just my mind. But I first, with every new case, with every video, I enter it as a skeptic, even though I know it's real. I don't know the people that are talking, and I don't know if what they're saying is real. So automatic skeptic, but I think let's replace the word skeptic with critical thinker, because I think that's more or less what you and I are. Is we're not just because we believe in UFOs, we're not just going to jump on everything that comes out and say, oh, that's real, it's got to be real. We're first going to look at it. We're going to take all the information, think about it, try to make sense of it, and then have our reaction. And I think you and I are similar in that. And
well, I mean, in answer to the first thing about I don't know that I can add. Well, I certainly can't add a definite answer to the famous Pentagon videos, right?
Right.
And because nobody can, and I don't trust anybody that says that they know for sure, because at the moment it's quite intriguing. So I'm totally with you in that sense. I get a bit annoyed sometimes if people kind of dismiss you as a skeptic on the basis that you don't buy Roswell. I don't know. I think that's a narrow-minded approach in another way, and sometimes it rules out a lot of the more bizarre things that you might experience, and it rules out a lot of the a lot of the more interesting explanations for me. So if you go with the Pentagon videos for a second,
Yeah.
if we were being open-minded about this, if we were going to encounter alien hardware, that's as likely a scenario as any. Almost like something comes into the atmosphere and it has the look of a very highly, by our standards, highly engineered bit of remote technology that we can't keep up with, and it's doing its own job and we can't match it, right? And we might not even we might be looking at it and not know what its job is. Yeah, you know, it's that level. And so in that sense, they're intriguing videos, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I could ramble on about it, or I know he's not the most popular person in ufology in the United States, but Brian Dunning did a complete demolition over 2 episodes of a lot of the people promoting that, didn't he? And he went through all the various, so, you know, it's a lot of the same people, Robert Bigelow and all the associates. And if you look at the whole history of that and the different companies they've set up, which occasionally have had public funding and occasionally have come from Bigelow's own aerospace company, and of course he's loaded from his hotel operations and stuff like that, isn't he? Yeah. And so the so-called Pentagon videos here, his operation was subcontracted, weren't they? The tax dollars went to a contractor, basically, which is Bigelow's operation, under one of the monikers that they've adapted over the years. You know, these advanced aerospace, you know, the weapons recognition program and stuff that they've had. So if you were going to be a total cynic, you'd say they've come to the end of where they are. They've put the best evidence in front of the public, and this is partly to get more funding and more notoriety. Yeah. I don't know, is the honest to God truth on that. I know I read, there's a detailed analysis in one of the more skeptical UFO books about the fact that one of those 3 videos provably comes from a German lab that's a specialist in post-production, doesn't it? I.e. the video you see, I'd have to turn around and grab the book from another room, but Sue, I can't remember off the top of my head, but anyway, one of those 3 videos, and that doesn't stack up for me. Like, number one, why didn't you show us the original video? Number 2, why of every place on Earth that would do the final edit, do you send it to Germany? Yeah, they're specialists in special effects, right? But yeah. You know, I mean, if all you're doing, I mean, this is gun camera film, right? Apparently, so why do you need the post-production? You know, but anyway, and I know other possibilities, if you were going to be totally cynical, the United States has a history of staging fantastic UFO cases at a point when they might be beneficial for another reason. So when this first came out, and I was promoting the book last year, I used to quote the Washington overflights of 1952, right? Which was the perfect UFO case. I mean, on 2 Saturday, but first of all, there's weird things about these. It's the perfect case. There are UFOs over the Capitol on 2 successive Saturday nights, right? So on the one hand, it's everything that the day the Earth stood still, the 50s movie, was suggesting would happen, or almost everything. On another tack, it's like, why the hell would the aliens pick Saturday night? I mean, do they operate on our time, you know? So the Pentagon videos, to me, resembled that in the sense that they were spectacular, and it was almost like exactly what you'd expect to see in exactly the place that you might expect to see it. Yeah, you know, this is basically a battle-equipped military flotilla off the coast of California encountering this stuff. Yeah, and the eyewitnesses are, you know, combat pilots, people who are trained to fly the best machinery you've got, i.e. these are your top guns, yeah, right? You know, these are the people that the military would deem to have, in inverted commas, the right stuff, and they're bemused at what they're seeing. Now, I don't know, I mean, possibilities which might make more sense. The United States is testing its best cutting-edge hardware against its own people, and that's not unusual. That has happened in the past, and when enough time has passed, those stories have been declassified because there's no more need for secrecy, right? So again, if you turn the clock back, a staple of UFO books in the early 1960s was that there were craft being seen that were just flying too fast and too high in the atmosphere to be planes. Yeah. Well, they weren't. I think if you read things like Travels in Dreamland by Phil Patton, which is a book about Area 51 and all the related goings on in other places that are linked to that, the U-2 spy plane and the Blackbird, right? But it was not common knowledge with civilian or military radar operators that these things were out there, and there was very good reason for it not to be common knowledge. But in fact, it's an interesting story about the U-2, that the Russians didn't believe it for a while, and then when they did believe it, they kind of couldn't believe it. Like, nothing can fly that high, because they couldn't hit it with a missile. And it's like, no, there's nothing can go beyond a missile. How the hell can a plane get above a missile? And then actually because it was so cutting edge, they reasoned certain things. And the Russians, apparently, the reason that Gary Powers survived the shooting down of the plane was that the Russians had figured something out that the Americans hadn't, which is that while you couldn't hit it with a missile, to be that high, it must be very fragile. So if you exploded enough missiles in the upper atmosphere and set a shockwave up, the plane would disintegrate, which is exactly what happened. And that's why Gary Powers survived, apparently, because the plane wasn't hit. So he had a split second when he knew that the plane was toast, but he was still in one piece and he could eject. Yeah.
Wow.
Now, so there's a whole history. I mean, if you think then when that happened in the early 1960s, there were radar operators who would come home from work and it'd be like, I saw it. I know we tracked it. That thing was moving too fast and too high to be a plane. And they would talk, and years later, it's the Blackbird, isn't it? So it may be that we're looking at that, okay? And again, if you were going to be a complete cynic, it might be that, this is bloody, I don't even want to get into that war in Ukraine and everything, but it's an interesting political time. So the United States, at the end of the Second World War, about 1947, I think had half the wealth on Earth, right? And gradually that position's been eroded to the point where you're now looking at a century in which China will be the major military and economic power unless something radical changes, right?
Right.
So it might be a good time to get another panic on the go to convince everybody that you need even more of those dollars going into black projects to keep pace, yeah? And what better than the UFO thing? In the mid-50s, people were encouraged by kind of like UFO movies and stuff just to look up. And that was at a time when there was a danger in the United States that there might be incoming Russian aircraft. And there were certain places, particularly like on your western coast, Oregon and places like that, where there simply wasn't good radar coverage. So anybody spotting anything would have been helpful, right? Yeah. I mean, that's, if you like, that's my take on it. I don't know, and I don't trust anybody who says that they do know. I think it fits a pattern that we've seen before, but the superficial details are very different. But on the other hand, I think there are a handful of really intriguing cases about really of weird things that have been spotted. And if I was putting money on something being genuinely extraterrestrial, it wouldn't be the Pentagon videos. I would go with the Oumuamua object that passed through the solar system a few years ago. Again, nobody knows, but it's interesting that Avi Loeb, who's a professor of astronomy at Harvard University, wrote a book called Extraterrestrial. And his view of it is that that object is some kind of remote probe, and he thinks he came up with a quite plausible theory, if it is, about how it actually operates, because it just so happens that he's part of a small team that are trying to figure out how we send an object to the nearest star. Yeah, and crudely, I'm not a scientist here, but crudely, that you put like a kind of solar sail up. The thing's got like a solar cell on it, so it takes energy from nearby stars, and then it just fires like a beam at the sail. So it basically turns this into a laser, and then it almost provides its own wind and can get up to eventually in space, and then it can travel almost indefinitely. And his suggestion is that Oumuamua is that, because that to him explains why it flew around the sun and didn't do what a comet or an asteroid would do. It didn't lose mass, and it was that's his argument crudely. It was engineered for that, and it might just be traveling through space. And his argument is that it behaves in just the way that the craft that he's working on with a bunch of other people to get to the nearest star system outside of our own solar system, it's pretty much the way that they expect their creation to behave when they finally get it up and running.
Yeah, because didn't it speed up once it went around the sun?
Mm.
And that's not supposed to happen, right?
Yeah. But the thing that intrigued quite a few scientists was that had it been a comet or an asteroid, it would have lost mass. Basically, it would, as it went around the sun, part of it would have disintegrated to do with the gravity, and it didn't. It didn't seem to. So, and I mean, if we're going to encounter alien hardware, for my money, that would be how it would happen. It would be, from the point of view of the hardware, it would be quite a mundane event. As in, just for the sake of going with this story for a minute, if we assume that Oumuamua is that animal, that it's actually some probe that just goes through space and gathers information, then it makes perfect sense to me, as it did to Carl Sagan actually, that it might pass Earth and think, well, nah, let's go somewhere interesting. Yeah, right. We've mapped it. We've clocked it. That's it. We're on our way somewhere else now. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And that's probably one of the most significant, undeniable cases. Oumuamua. I mean,
yeah,
no one can say, it definitely was or definitely wasn't. The James Webb Telescope. Are you excited about that as I am? I mean, oh my God. I'm not sure if it was a real picture, but I saw, I think it was a week or two ago, they were still aligning some of the cameras, and they were focused on one star, but they had like 8 pictures of the star. Last night, I think, unless someone just photoshopped it, I think they had all the cameras aligned and another shot of that star, and it was in color, and it was just the one star, and you could see a bunch of galaxies behind it. So I don't know if that was the first image or not. I'm going to have to verify it because I looked at it late last night, but I am super excited to possibly look back in time as far as like 500 million years after the Big Bang, I think they're saying. I mean,
absolutely.
Wow.
And I'm really excited about the certainties it will give us about planetary systems and just the ability to look at how the whole galaxy is made up, because I think that it'll answer some of the questions that Frank Drake and his mates were asking decades ago, that this whole Drake equation about where you try and figure out the likelihood of life. I mean, that when that first started and the search for extraterrestrial intelligence began on the back of it, they were the best guesses, and the James Webb Telescope will give definite answers to some of that. We'll get a much better idea of how many planets exist in what we regard as a habitable zone, and it's going to answer a lot of those things, and we may spot things that we didn't expect to see, which would be, I mean, I've read quite a few arguments that say that if there's extraterrestrial activity around us, it would make a lot of sense to orbit and to set up satellites and to set up probes that watch, rather than it would to come and land on a planet. Yeah, and certainly, I mean, we're already like that. We can manage a lot of the habitat if we want to on Earth without being that invasive on it. We monitor it and we stop things happening. So I won't bore you with the ins and outs, but I'm involved in an environmental project to do with one of my jobs at the moment. So I'm going to make a hell of a difference to the life of bugs and small animals in a wood very close to where I live, right? But they'll never know it.
Right.
Just the means for them to have a better life will be magically gifted to them. Now, who's to say that the same thing doesn't happen to us, and we're just unaware of it. You know, and if there's anything like that going on, if there's stuff active in, you know, if there are bodies that look like they're planets or asteroids or something, and actually they're not, they're artificial, our best chance to see it so far in our history will be the James Webb Telescope.
Yeah. Oh, what's that? I can't remember the name of Michio Kaku. He was talking about the actual stars, like a third type 3 civilization would be able to harness the power of the star, and they'd actually build something around the star, but I can't remember the name of it. So we might be able to see something like that too.
Oh yeah, that's right. And I mean, there are a number of ideas about like the again, and I can't remember the whole argument on this, but the Dyson sphere is the
Dyson sphere, yeah.
Yeah, right. Which, but it is, isn't it? It's about, that would be evidence of civilization, because they would do logical things to harness all the energy in the near area, right? And we'd see the evidence of that in just the same way that when we first started spotting planets that are in that are out there in different solar systems, we didn't spot the planets, we spotted the change in light as they moved in front of the host star, you know, and obviously it's based on mathematical calculations. We'll see a hell of a lot more with the James Webb Telescope, and you know, I mean, that's massive. It's hugely exciting if you think that in the Voyager space probes and the things that have gone off it, which were cutting edge in the 1970s. I mean, we've come so far in such a short time that they're redundant now. They've done their job, and you know, that's just in a couple of generations, basically. Yeah.
I mean, just imagine 50, maybe 100 more years, assuming humans are still here, and not much has changed, you know. We still have electricity and all that, and we're still continuing to get more technologically advanced. Think about maybe, you know, 1,000 years or 2,000 years. So how are we going to look? Are we going to change our technology? Are we going to be able to reach the stars? You know, civilizations that have been around thousands of years longer than us, or maybe millions or even billions of years, certainly would have very high technology. Could they all make it here? Probably not, but I'm assuming a lot of them can.
Carl Sagan's view of it was that the reason that they haven't is that we're just not that interesting. And if they got to that stage, they would regard us as uninteresting. You know, it might be a watching brief at best, and it might be a watching brief from such a distance that we wouldn't even suspect that we were being watched. I genuinely don't know, Scott, and I've got...
Yeah.
I mean, I was having a pretty gloomy conversation online about this the other day, that it was somebody I know who's quite into politics and is getting really bothered about this war in Ukraine, because he's bricking it about what Vladimir Putin might be capable of doing if he can't win and he can't find a way out, right? And this goes back to there was a clip of Putin telling a couple of his senior military officers to get ready for using the nukes, wasn't it? And their faces are less than enthusiastic, shall we say, of the guys he's talking to. But my mate was pointing something out which I hadn't thought about in as much detail, that Russia used an anti-satellite weapon, didn't it? It tested one and it blew one of its own old satellites up, yeah? No, they did, and it caused an absolute stink, because all the other nations that are in space pointed out that they couldn't possibly account for where all the fragments would fly off, and there's enough junk flying around the Earth in orbit anyway, right? And of course, my mate was saying, well, we might never get into space, because if Putin's losing and he just throws all his toys out of the pram, metaphorically, one of the things he might do is turn a few more of those weapons loose on things like, you know, major things in space, and he'll suddenly surround the Earth with so much junk that we're all trapped.
Yeah. That's
and I
true.
hadn't thought about that. It's like, God, yeah, that's actually, that would not be hard to do. The technology to do that exists, and if somebody was mad enough, they could do it. So, you know, I guess the point I'm making in a roundabout way is that I would love, like you, I would love to think that, not in my lifetime maybe, but my grandkids might know things that I spent my life trying to figure out, and that would be brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's possible, and that's the positive way. The other way of looking at it is that we might be a bit deluded, and it may be that, and certainly some of the people in the original SETI team and ever since then, one school of thought has been that it might be in the nature of most civilizations and most planets that become inhabited, that they either pollute themselves out of existence or destroy themselves accidentally, or some combination thereof. Yeah, or just simply exhaust their resources to the point where they can survive but they're trapped. And I mean, it's entirely possible. Hell, if we don't get serious about the environment, then it doesn't matter what we think we might do. We might create such problems for ourselves that we don't have any choice but to deal with them. And I know something I read recently. There's a guy called, oh God, I can't remember his name. He's a professor at the University of Cumbria. I'm going to go over my notepad because I was talking to somebody about this the other day. But he's just written a book called Deep Adaptation, and his argument is bloody gloomy. He's basically saying that the problem with the environment is already past the point where we can sort it. So the only thing that makes any sense for us to do is to prepare for the inevitable environmental crisis and figure out how humanity is going to survive. Jem Bendel, that's his name. It's like literally on my notepad. It's like it's on the what. I'm going to have to pick a week when I'm having a really good time to survive that book.
Oh.
Yeah, but I mean, who knows? If that's the case, then any cosmic plans are on hold until we do something about that, and that might be so many lifetimes away that, if people find our discussion in 100 years' time, we'll look like a couple of eccentric dreamers, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Or we could be like the Trousers of England, like everyone will have to watch this show in order to get on to being a ufologist.
Yeah, who knows? But I don't know about you. I enjoy putting this stuff out there. I enjoy talking to people about it. One of the ways that I learn and kind of process me thinking about the whole thing is to engage with people, and I'm liking that it's back to live events and I can meet people again, and there's more of this going on, because it's strange as it sounds, these are the sanest moments when you can talk about it. It's not just you.
I've never been to a UFO convention, but I really think I should go to one, because no matter who I try to talk UFOs with, family members, friends, they'll listen for like a minute or whatever, but they don't have much to offer as far as, well, wow, let's talk about this. What'd you see? Like I've got no reason to lie to my parents, so when I say, Dad, check out this UFO I saw, and this is actually a drawing of it.
All right.
And it actually cloaked from the top down, right in front of my eyes. It was a daytime sighting. So I drew that picture a long time ago. I showed it to my dad. Dad, I saw this right outside, a couple of months ago, 11:30 a.m. I was going to get lunch, and I look up and this thing is just going back and forth in the sky. And then it, after about, 5 seconds of doing that, I thought, wow, I wish it would come closer. And so it was like 2 seconds after that, it started flying at me and almost passed directly over my head, just a little bit off on an angle. And it was black underneath, and, it just basically cloaked from the top down, and I lost it in the sun. And, I told my dad, and he was just like, oh, wow, cool. So, what else is going on? It's just, it's crazy to me that people aren't fascinated like I am by this stuff. And I don't
But
know.
you actually explained something there which is central to all the experiences that I've had in terms of being involved in the UFO community, Scott, that I don't know what you saw, but from when I first got involved in it, every meeting I've been to, one of the reasons people go is that they're experiences, and you run into people everywhere. So there's one of the biggest secondhand bookshops in the UK is very close to me, and I was up there the other day because I can still go and buy the books I couldn't afford when I was a student. Right, I can still find the original editions there, and stuff like that. So I'm working my way through stuff that I knew was around that other people had read and whatever. And I met somebody, we were just browsing the same bookshelf, and obviously we were talking about what we were looking at, and within a couple of minutes she pointed out to me that she'd been abducted, and absolutely no reason to disbelieve it. I mean, if I was in the room with her or wherever it was that this happened, whether I'd have seen the same thing is another question. But and I put her in touch with a group that help abductees and stuff. And my whole life, when I've been involved in this, there are people coming looking for answers at conferences. It's certainly something that goes on. And the last talk I gave was to a bunch of people. Sometimes I just talk to groups of people who've got general interests. So sorry, the second last talk I gave was to a bunch of people who had an interest in the paranormal, and quite a few people came forward with very strange experiences. And you're describing there like you wished something would happen in front of you and it kind of responds.
Yeah.
And that's not unusual, actually. There are people who see things. Now, I'd be an idiot to turn around to any of these people and say, I know what you saw. I mean, I've read loads on this. I know some people would come forward and say, well, actually, there's this psychological condition, there's this eye condition, this would explain it. And no. And it's been a problem for years. Certainly Alan Hynek, for example, was one of the first people to really isolate this, that when he started off as a kind of professional debunker, he went to a few cases where strange things had happened, and he was the guy that came up with the theory about marsh gas at one point. Yeah. And it became in some of the UFO literature that became something that was used to beat skeptics up. But to be fair to Alan Hynek, he realized himself the futility of that argument, and by the end of his life he hadn't necessarily got to any answers, but he'd certainly got to a point where he thought the best you could do was to gather all these experiences, investigate them properly, apply the best critical thinking on what you knew, which would explain a lot, and then you're still left with stuff that you can't explain. And that's one of the reasons I'm really interested, because every once in a while I discover something or I hear something, or and it just makes you think. And I know I'm trying at the moment to get my head around something which is really it's taxing me a bit, because there's a physicist, a guy called Gerard Tufte, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist, right? And after he won his Nobel Prize, I didn't realize this, but this is quite common among Nobel Prize winners, that the second they win the prize, it's like, oh, get in, now I can do what I really want to do. Nobody
Yeah.
can take this away from me. So subsequent to winning his Nobel Prize, he started arguing that basically the quantum theory supports the notion that there's almost like a divine consciousness in the universe, right? And that it interacts with us. I mean, this is his theory, his papers on this have not been well received by everybody, but effectively he almost believes a kind of cosmic, intelligent cosmos view of the whole thing. But he's a bit of an outlier in the sense that he thinks that quantum theory, the sort of string theory stuff that's been the basis of physics for ages, has got the beginnings of an argument that would actually prove this. I mean, clearly we're nowhere near it. Now, I mean, who knows? We could spend. I mean, it's a complicated argument, and I don't understand enough to give you the whole argument. But if you boil it down, it's an interesting notion because it's quite an open-minded notion, but it basically suggests that all the most uncanny experiences and what you're describing, these things when they're uncanny, you're interacting with something, there's no doubt it's in front of you, it's completely puzzling, it's like amazing, and at the same time just absolutely, it's scary because it's just your reality hasn't prepared you for it. Well, you know, in Gerard Tuft's view, then it may be that these are kind of like manifestations of something like a higher consciousness or whatever, and you know, that it would begin to explain it. And also it's a kind of unifying theory because 300 years ago, if somebody encountered a nature spirit that behaved in an uncanny way, which we tend not to see these days, then it might have been the same phenomena, and it might just have been contacting you in a way that you could understand. I mean, who knows? I find that quite an interesting notion. I'm struggling with it because my whole background is that I taught professional writing, so I'm much more a kind of liberal arts person. So the physics just defeats me, and
Right.
there aren't many. I kind of get his arguments and his ideas, but there's nothing much written on that explains the whole thing, unless you share his knowledge of physics, which, you know, clearly most of us don't. But I mean, who knows? Your experience, and you know, I whenever I've been to conferences and stuff, you meet people who will tell you the strangest things, and they're not lying, absolutely not lying, and it's made a difference to their lives. And I'm assuming that's one of the reasons you're doing your podcast, yeah?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It was this this sighting that, you know, I had one before that, and I also had a childhood experience. But the one before that was an absolutely amazing sighting. I was 19 at the time. It was just a red orb that was flying really about 10 feet above the houses, ranch houses in my neighborhood in Schaumburg, Illinois. And I got close enough, within about 10 or 15 feet of this thing a couple different times. And, you know, because I was kind of chasing around in my car through the neighborhood. And it was mechanical. It wasn't like a plasma. I could see the tiny little dots of lights, like LED lights, the way you'd describe them now. Of course, we didn't have them back in like 91 or 92 when this was, but that's what it looked like to me, like a round globe about the size of a car, you know, and it had thousands of tiny little LED lights, and it was just circling my neighborhood for like 20 minutes. And I was out there with my camera, and unfortunately, you know, back in the day, we used to use film. Remember those days? And
Oh yeah.
the film had already been used. So like my grandma had taken all the pictures and never put a fresh roll in. So unfortunately, I would have had some of the best UFO pictures ever, but I was taking pictures of, and the film was already used up, so nothing came out. But that was my first sighting, and you know, for a couple of days, I was really like into the whole UFO thing. But you know, I was also into music, and I had a band, so I just kind of forgot about it. But when I saw that saucer, that was the one that blew me away, and that changed my life. I think about that sighting probably 100 times a day still. I can't get it out of my mind, and I've had a lot since. But that was the one, and completely changed my life. And you know, I went in and I told my wife about it because she saw me standing outside, you know, in the middle of the street. You know, she's like, "You look like an idiot. What are you doing?" You know. And so I told her, and she was just like, "All right, did you get the lunch?" You know. In fairness to her, you know, the whole subject kind of does scare her a little bit, but it was about a month, not even a month ago, about 3-4 weeks ago, I was sitting in the downstairs right after dinner, right by the window in my chair, just kind of looking out the window. I'm being on my phone, and my wife was to my left. She was on the couch, and she was on her phone, and I just looked out the window, and I saw a UFO, and it was, it was just like a kind of like a little football, and it was just doing circles coming in and out of this cloud. And I had been wishing for this ever since 2010. Today's actually the anniversary of the day I saw this. Yeah, March 17th, 2010 at 11:32 a.m. So we're past 11:30, I think, now by now. But yeah, it's the anniversary of it. But ever since then, I figured she thought I was nuts. So, but she actually saw this one with me. I said, because I was sitting by the window, I said, "Hey, do you want to see a UFO?" Because they're so common to me now. It's not like I didn't like freak out. So she came over and she looked out the window, and I said, "It's that black thing that's going in and out of the cloud. Do you see it?" She's like, "Yeah, I see it." So she saw the exact same thing as me. It wasn't different. And I don't know why. Actually, I wasn't on my phone. I apologize. I was just sitting there, because if I had my phone, I would have taken a picture or tried to. But when she came up to the window, I said, "Keep an eye on it. I'm going to run downstairs and get my phone." Instead of just saying, "Use your phone, take a picture," or "Give me your phone." But I just kind of assumed it would be there when I got back. I ran outside. It was gone. She said it went in the cloud and it never came out. So I was like, okay, well, my wife saw one with me. I can't ask for much more than that. She knows now that I actually do see these things, and I'm not, cuckoo. But yeah, so that was really important for me. And where do you think the future of ufology is going?
Well, I think it's a lot of things. I think, first of all, can I just comment on what you're saying there? Get yourself along to some events and stuff. It's one thing I used to love, and I will start loving again as soon as these conferences kick off properly. But if you walk in to a UFO conference, like on a Saturday morning, and you're there for a weekend, the second you're in the building, any notion of normal is just out the window. And it's like a rock festival, but way more cosmic, in that sense. And that for me, that's something I've always loved about them. And it's interesting. One of the things you're saying is a story. It's a similar thing that I've heard loads of times. And this is just off the back of, obviously, if you go and speak at an event, you'll come off the stage and somebody will come and find you and want to tell you what happened to them. And what's really interesting about your account is that it's not what people often expect when they're looking at spectacular stories and people are telling them on TV. It's that collision in it of something amazing and something really mundane. That's the story I've heard the whole time. Like, yeah, great, let's eat, or versions of that. And I mean, one of the things, when I was the same research group, when I was in that research group years and years ago with Ralph Noyes, one encounter we had. So one guy came to us because he hadn't a clue what had happened to him, and what he was describing was an event quite similar to a famous British case, which had happened. The famous case had happened near a nuclear power station, and this guy had an encounter on the coast, but he was he's like a manly guy. He worked for one of the main utility companies. He was on an emergency call out in the middle of the night. He'd seen a weird light. He'd lost some time. When he came to, he wasn't completely sure whether his vehicle was in the same place as where he'd been sitting before. And this whole thing had started while he was sitting in a van just doing some paperwork after an emergency call out. And this was an interesting story, but the first thing he said when he came to the group was he didn't want any publicity. He wanted us to help him to understand what the hell had gone on. And central to this was that his wife would never find out, because it was like It wasn't that he was doing nothing wrong at all. He wasn't there to see his girlfriend or anything. It was just that it had messed up his sense of who he was so much. He didn't want his friends knowing. He didn't want to walk into the pub as it would be with us, the bar as it would be with you, like, that he didn't want people pointing at him and going, yeah, you're the guy that sees Martians. Um, and and you'll hear that story time and time again. It's like, I'm just doing my normal job. I've got my normal friends. Oh shit, I saw a UFO, what, and so there is that level. If you get in, I mean, obviously, if you go to any kind of conference and you get in the room with people, you've got all the little groups, the serious researchers, the cynics, the skeptical ones, the ones who are just, you're backing away if they talk to you for more than 3 or 4 minutes, and then a lot of people who've got an informed interest like you and me. And okay, this is me saying, we're normal, everybody else ain't, but it's not like that. But a lot of people who can't let go of wanting to know probably don't believe they'll ever know everything that they would like to know in their own lifetime, but have faith that if they keep on investigating and they keep on learning, things will become clearer and they'll learn from it. So I mean, that actually leads us into the future of ufology. I think there's a lot of things, Scott, that I hope to live long and healthy enough that I'll see some of these things come by. The James Webb Telescope will answer a lot of questions, right?
Yeah.
It will give us a lot more information about the way the cosmos is constructed. There will be answers that will come off the back of that. There is always cutting edge scientific research that tells us loads of things. So Stephen Hawking did not live long enough to see the latest stuff on black holes, where there's some suggestion there's almost like they're talking about like a kind of hair around the black holes, like there's an interface, but there's areas which aren't black hole and aren't not black hole, that there are these strings that come out of them, which all are going to tell us something about the way that the universe is constructed. And I think some of the answers that we want will come from science, because we'll understand the strangest phenomena. I mean, we're clearly going to get to that. There's the stuff that's going on now. So years and years ago, I met a guy from Project Hesteland, which is a research group in Norway. There are these weird lights at the top of a valley in Norway. Researchers have been looking at them for years. They're not intelligently constructed craft. They're an atmospheric phenomena, but nobody understands. There's good ideas. They will eventually prove what these are. Science will chip away at these things, because when they're in front of us, we can learn, and that means we ask better questions, and that means we learn more, and eventually we'll get there, right? I mean, my own guess is that if we ever get to a point where there's one phenomena or one event that proves itself to be extraterrestrial, it will be probably closer to Oumuamua or the wow signal. Something will come up, some random thing will come up that probably wasn't ever really directed at us, but we'll spot it and there'll be no doubt. Now, I don't know how likely that is to happen. There's the more cynical, the Carl Sagans of this world would say very unlikely, because we're just not special enough that even if it's out there, they wouldn't be in our neighborhood to be spottable. But the better we get at looking and understanding, the more likely we would be to spot any random thing like that. I think, all right, the other side of it is, I think if you're going to look at things like your Pentagon videos, I think that the leading people who've got, who get out there and have documentary programs and all that will keep on going. It's regardless of how good the stories are in those programs, and some of them are better than others, it's infotainment. Yeah. The job of most of the documentaries is to sell an audience to the advertisers. Okay, I'm not knocking Lou Elizondo or any of those guys at all, but it's entertainment as the people who put it out there. It might be the History Channel or somebody like that, but the bottom line is, if they don't sell advertising, they're out of business. So first and foremost, their question is, can we sell this? So the future of ufology will be more of the same, and that's why, for example, some of the big cases keep going back. And in that, you mentioned you're in a band. You don't look like you were, right? but the music industry and bands and stuff, I think there's a relevance here. it's the same thing, right? So I'm just finishing that 1, 2, 3, 4 book about the Beatles, and they mentioned Dick Rowe. I mean, I don't know if he's well known in America, but he was the guy at Decca Records who turned down the Beatles. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
right. And his argument was he turned them down because guitar groups had had their day, right? And the 1, 2, 3, 4, the book ends with I can't remember who he is now, but he's an erudite British critic from the era when the Beatles were around, and he makes some scathing comment about nobody's going to be listening to this stuff in the 21st century, right? And sorry, it's relevant to ufology because I think part of the future of ufology is that what actually happens is that we'll always keep repeating the same stuff that's on the collision of entertainment. That's always going to be the popular stuff until some huge event comes along and totally overturns what we understand. And it happens for the same reason that people keep reinventing guitar bands, because it's just great. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I mean, the bottom line is guitar bands won't go out of fashion because if 4 or 5 people stand around with guitars and bass and drums and stuff and they make that noise, it's just brilliant, right? Yeah. And somebody 15 is just starting to do that, and you can't turn around to them and say, well, this has been going on for decades, mate, you know. Yeah, everything you're doing Black Sabbath did better, just forget it, you know. And so the future of ufology will be that, to a certain extent. Actually, it will keep on, a lot of what we understand and see will keep on generating itself the same way that superhero movies do and rock music does and all the rest of it. But in the middle of that, there will be amazing stories, and people will not stop having experiences that change their lives. I think we'll get better at understanding them. I said ages ago now, and I totally believe this, that I think at the moment, I think we're nowhere near intelligent enough to ask some of the right questions. And I think that one of the things that blinds us to that is that people get very excited. There's always a fixation about finding all these details. How do you put it? The wrong-headed belief is that if a story comes out and you go and dig up all the details, you're going to prove it to everybody, and that's the end. It's sorted. And actually, the history of ufology says the opposite. The bigger these stories get, the more they fall apart. Yeah. So I think the future of it will be that some big stories will come along, crash and burn, but along the way, little nuggets will come up that'll help us to build a better understanding. All right. That's a bit of a rant, but I mean, that's basically what I think.
Yeah. Well, I've had a great time talking
Yeah.
with you and everyone. Neil Nixon, UFOs, Aliens in a Battle for the Truth. Do you have a website?
Yeah, I've got neilnixon.com.
Okay.
I'm probably not the most significant Neil Nixon on the planet, but I got there first.
You got the name. All right. Well, then that makes you the most significant.
I've got .com, yeah. So seriously, Scott, if anybody's, I mean, I do live talks and stuff, and there's a link from my website to the live talk site where there's a number of talks at my Beatles and my UFO talk, and one about writing for a living, which are the ones I like doing best at the moment. Yeah, but if I get a load of email and stuff through the days, if people contact me through my site, yeah, I always answer those emails first because they're more interesting than a lot of the other garbage I get.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, if people want to contact me, they can do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I would definitely leave all those links in the description box. Neil, thank you so much for being on UFO Unlimited. And everyone, please hit that subscribe button. We have more guests coming up, and you will definitely be impressed with more of the people we have on. We've already had 2 great guests, Preston Dennett and now Neil Nixon. And coming up next, I'm not going to tell you who. You're going to have to wait, but it's confirmed, and I'm excited about it. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll talk to you next time on UFO Unlimited.